various different toxic chemicals, not all chemicals, have links to different things like harming the developing brain or cancer, hormone disruption. And so the question now becomes, how can we ask harder questions before we release a lot of these chemicals into the consumer marketplace? They should be proven safe long before they hit store shelves.
You're listening to Be Well by Kelly LeVeque. In today's episode, I welcome Lindsay Dahl, a mom, activist, and nationally recognized social impact leader who has played a pivotal role in passing more than 30 state and federal laws to eliminate toxic chemicals from consumer products and the environment. Her advocacy work has been featured in publications such as the New York Times, Fast Company, and Vogue. Over the years, Lindsay has held leadership roles in influential environmental health organizations, including Safer Chemicals, Healthy Families, and has brought her mission-driven mindset to leading consumer brands like Ritual and Beautycounter. She currently serves on the board of Toxic-Free Future and the Chamber of Mothers. Cleaning House is her debut book, a powerful call to action for families, policymakers, and businesses to prioritize health and the safety in everyday products. Lindsay, it is such a pleasure to welcome you to the show. I feel like you have been the scientific expert for brands that are so trusted like Ritual and Beautycounter, always breaking down the science and the studies. You've been an activist for so long. And now your book is here, Cleaning House, The Fight to Rid Our Homes of Toxic Chemicals. It's so fun to have you on the show, and I'm really just excited to learn.
Thank you for having me. I'm so excited to be here.
So obviously, if anyone has followed along with you, you have been fighting this fight for decades and representing brands that, like I said, that were all about transparency and ingredient quality. But with this book, you've kind of given us an insight behind the curtain of like what it looks like to actually get policy change. You've helped pass over 30 state and federal laws addressing toxic chemicals, and it feels like we're inundated. Like, how did you even get started in this? How did this become your passion project? I mean, it's a big fight to fight, and I feel like pounding the pavement.
Yeah, thanks. I got into environmental health, which is basically the field of science. You could call it consumer safety or today's clean market or what have you, but a little bit by accident. So when I studied for both in high school and my undergrad in environmental science and political science, obviously correlates with what I do today. But what I was really passionate about at the time was climate change, working on more traditional environmental conservation. So protecting public lands from development, those types of kind of traditional environmental topics. But, I graduated from college. I had a long list of passions and a very short resume, as many people do when they graduate from college. And I couldn't find full-time work in the environmental nonprofit community, which is where I was kind of hoping to go. I stumbled upon an interview to work on environmental health. And the woman, I tell this story in the book of the woman who was pitching me on it. I think about it, I'm like fresh out of college, and she was talking about things like children's toys, like stuff that were just not on my radar at all. And I was like, I kind of begrudgingly took the job. Mm-hmm. Little did I know that connecting people's home environment, so the different products, the indoor air quality, all the things that are in our home environment, was actually one of the biggest bridges to help people care about the bigger issues I was thinking about. So wildlife, contamination, lakes and rivers and streams. And so it was almost like by accident that the bridge between toxic chemicals and our consumer products would lead me to also be able to work on these bigger issues that I was passionate about, toxic chemicals and our water and wildlife.
So when you look at someone's home and the number of toxic chemicals they're exposed to, how does that impact our environment, and how does that impact their personal health?
Well, I'll use a good example. So it kind of depends is the short answer. The science around our exposure to toxic chemicals in the home and exposure to things like, a great example that everyone can kind of connect to is when you're pregnant, you're advised not to have tuna or certain fishes that are high in the food chain because of things like mercury. That's the concept of toxic chemicals, the bioaccumulation building up in wildlife. So there's well-studied, different research around things like persistent bioaccumulative toxics that are pollution in wildlife. If you think back to Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, we were learning about pesticides and what that meant for bird and wildlife populations. But what has really kind of exploded in the last, I would say, 40 years or so is a field of research of looking at these same toxic chemicals and the wildlife implications. And what does it mean for human health? Because it's a different but related set of questions. And the original hypothesis, if you kind of go back to when the industrial boom took place post World War II, suddenly we had all these great products that were coming into our homes that in reality made our lives a lot easier. The problem is that there was kind of what I called team old science, which is traditional toxicology, was asking questions of how much of these chemicals could ultimately end up in our bodies and harm us.
Mm-hmm.
And at the time, the answer was, oh, this isn't something we need to worry about. Well, fast forward with this field of science, it shows us that toxic chemicals, number one, don't stay put. Oftentimes in the products in our homes, they migrate. They do end up in human bodies through biomonitoring studies. And that wouldn't be a problem if they weren't also linked to harm. And so various different toxic chemicals, not all chemicals, have links to different things like harming the developing brain or cancer, hormone disruption. And so the question now becomes, how can we ask harder questions before we release a lot of these chemicals into the consumer marketplace? They should be proven safe long before they hit store shelves.
Can you give me a little history on how these chemicals are introduced into the marketplace and why they're not being proven safe? Like, who's in charge of saying these chemicals are allowed to be put in our skincare, in our cleaning products, in, on our kids' toys?
Yep. Great question. It will take a little bit of like going back to 7th grade civics class.
Let's do it.
But hopefully I'll make it more interesting. So there's two different things at play here. The first of which is a big law that was passed in the 1970s. So think about the 70s. Richard Nixon had started the Environmental Protection Agency, the first agency to regulate polluters. There was a bill that was passed in the 70s. The nickname for it was called TSCA. And it grandfathered in all at the time 62,000 chemicals that were used to make up a lot of the goods that are in our homes today. And it grandfathered those in and said, okay, well, anything after 1976, we're going to assess for safety before it enters the market. The take home is that there was a bunch of loopholes in this law. It was so weak, in fact, that the EPA tried to ban asbestos multiple times in the 90s and they couldn't. So the question quickly became, if this law is both grandfathering in all these toxic chemicals, including things we know like formaldehyde and PFAS that have known links to human health, what good is this law, right? So that's actually part of the story I tell of my journey in DC to help update this federal law. That's one of the primary reasons. Thankfully, in 2016, we passed updates to this legislation that ultimately basically requires companies, it's not perfect, but asks companies to ask harder questions before those products or chemicals enter into our products. The second thing is that a lot of people will say, well, okay, the FDA didn't move on mercury and skin lightening cream or formaldehyde and hair straightening treatments. Like, it must be the FDA's fault. I can understand why people think that. But the reality is that our federal agencies like the EPA and the FDA, by no means they're not perfect. I've been critiquing them my whole career. But they can't just take actions outside of the laws that they're handed from Congress. So we vote for our members of Congress. They pass legislation and basically rules to give to these agencies to say, hey, you can do this or you can't do that. And that's a way to protect business, right? So the agencies can't suddenly just go whole hog and start, making kind of reckless decisions. That's where the checks and balances of our government has been by design. But the problem is when we don't give new laws based on new science to those federal agencies, they can't actually take action. So we're kind of in a conundrum right now, but I will say that in the last 20 years, there's been a ton of really good progress at the state and federal level. And so the question today is, how can we make sure that those laws stay in place and they're not rolled back? And how can we get across the finish line the next chapter of work?
Oh, and you've been doing all of that work and you've been moving the needle for all of us and creating that progress. What are some of the biggest changes that you've seen in the last 10 years that you think have been monumental for human health?
So one of the things that I find most exciting is that a lot of the kind of, I would call them low hanging fruit, highly problematic chemicals that were widespread used in a lot of products, a lot of them have been moved away from, both through these state individual bans on toxic chemicals and through the marketplace responding to consumer pressure.
Hmm.
So the good news is our democracy and the power of our consumer voices in the marketplace continue to work.
Hmm.
And now the question is, so I'll give you a few examples of that. Um, Formaldehyde releasing preservatives that were used commonly in the beauty industry to preserve a formula 15 years ago are less common now on the marketplace. And things like certain types of plastics, I helped pass the first ban on BPA in baby bottles in the state of Minnesota back in 2009. You go to Target today and you're going to be hard pressed to find any water bottle, baby bottle aside, that is made from BPA. So there's a lot of these kind of low hanging fruit that we've seen a lot of big shifts. But the work that we have left to do comes in things that are maybe less sexy product categories. So for example, we were recarpeting our home recently, which is like certainly an interesting exercise, making sure that we want to hit our budget and also make sure we're not introducing various toxic chemicals that we're just going to continue to off gas.
Hmm.
Those less sexy kind of home building product categories, and especially products, especially in the beauty space that are targeted to women of color,
Hmm.
still need to see a lot more regulation of companies to push them in the right direction, and also market opportunities. So more companies making products that are safer.
Yeah. I mean, I have seen just in, I would say like the last 5 or 6 years, like the home industry really start to change. You have brands like, Caraway and Our Place kind of trying to come out with these ceramic pans, and people moving back towards stainless steel or cast iron, and really trying to just like one by one clean out their home. And I think if we pull that timeline even back 10 years ago when you were back, I think that was probably around the time Beautycounter started, and companies were coming out. It felt like the Credos of the world and all, the clean version of Sephora, and Sephora having like the clean line now where they're touting products without chemicals. Like, how much of the movement is becoming mainstream because of brands taking action like this? And for entrepreneurs looking to move into this space, like, what advice do you have for them to really make waves?
Good question. I think brands have a tremendous amount of power to move the market. And I think one of the things that was so kind of fun about being in the industry and moving from the nonprofit to the industry side around that time was brands and entrepreneurs and founders were starting to figure out how to make this sexy and like fun. So you didn't have to have things, no shade if like a crunchy aesthetic is your thing, but like everything didn't have to be taupe and green. And so brands that made kind of sophisticated, elegant, modern design with either sustainability or safety attributes, I think was a really positive move for the market. With that shift, of course, comes bad actors and greenwashers. And I think it's important to kind of look for and call out greenwashing. I think what I have learned being now in the industry side for 10 years is that a lot of greenwashing is not malicious. Sometimes it is from like larger corporations trying to
Mm.
steal market share, but especially for the new disruptor brands, I talk to founders all of the time. They just don't know what they don't know. So they don't know how hard it is to formulate with safer ingredients, or they make these overstated claims that they think they're doing. Good example of that would be something like heavy metals, hard to avoid,
Mhm.
whether it's in food or supplements or beauty products. And, companies are like, well, we're not adding heavy metals to our lipstick or our protein powder. And it's like, no, of course you're not, but you can't claim to be heavy metal free. That's out of naivete. So like there's a lot of kind of greenwashing that happens. But I would say for a lot of the players that have really moved the market across these different product categories, it has happened because they've made it appealing to consumers. And our job as consumers is to make sure that we, hold companies accountable, ask hard questions, and we're also forgiving to know that no one's perfect, and that's
Right.
okay. The idea is how can we incrementally move the market towards safer and more sustainable products.
My new amino acid supplements come in flavorless and lemon water, and they're flying off the shelves, and here's why. I have meticulously sourced these vegan fermented essential amino acids from Japan. I am so proud of this being made the Be Well way, with maximum quality and minimum ingredients. My flavorless is simply those vegan fermented essential amino acids from Japan. Our lemon water contains minimal ingredients of only organic lemon powder, organic citric acid, and organic monk fruit. No natural flavors, no artificial flavors, no artificial sweeteners, no emulsifiers, no additives. This is simply that nutrition targeted for your goals. If you want to give my Be Well protein or aminos a try, or restock it if you're already loving it, take advantage of my gift for podcast listeners. Code podcast10 is going to get you $10 off just for being a listener. Write it down and shop with me after you listen. This episode is brought to you by AG1, the one thing I never skip in my routine. I've been on a serious AG1 streak lately, and I haven't missed a day in weeks. It's become a grounding ritual I look forward to. Simple, nourishing, and the easiest way to support my body first thing. And now, AG1 just launched new flavors. I love them. I'm Team Tropical. It tastes like a beach vacation in a glass. Pineapple meets citrus. It's super refreshing and not too sweet. No grassy aftertaste. I mix it in cold water, and it delivers 75 vitamins, minerals, and whole food source nutrients to fill in nutritional gaps, support gut health, and set the tone for my day. It's not a silver bullet, but I think of AG1 as a daily nutritional insurance. One small habit that adds up to a big difference over time. And it's less than $3 a day. It's a simple investment with a big return. So give AG1's new flavors a try. Head to drinkag1.com/bewell. You'll also get a free welcome kit worth $76 when you subscribe, including 5 AG1 travel packs, a shaker, a canister, and a scoop. That's drinkag1.com/bewell to get started. Yeah. I mean, this unearths like so many extra questions that I would have around, it makes sense to me that an entrepreneur has their heart in the right place and they want to come out with a cleaner, better product. And then they're trusting the contract manufacturers to tell them exactly what's in their product. And maybe they're third-party testing, but maybe they don't understand that whatever's in the soil ends up in the plant, ends up ground up in that protein powder. And it's just like the way of the world. But for families, like actionable steps for families looking to clean up their house without, I love how you bucket people into being like either pragmatic or perfectionist. Like I feel like wellness can be so overwhelming for people. And when you start to tackle the house, which we talked about a little bit before we started, like Chris and I didn't have a house until we were 40. And then we bought a house and we had 2 young babies and I was pregnant. You're like kind of in the eye of the storm of, oh my gosh, let's get the chemicals out of the house, out of my, out of the diet, off the skincare products. It's like that is such a time for women specifically to change, moms to change like kind of the trajectory of their family's health. Like what should we really be focusing on so that we can be pragmatic about cleaning out our homes without feeling the overwhelm of having to be perfect?
Yep. I think the first thing, one of the kind of first pieces of advice I give people in the book, there's a really kind of rich take action section at the end. It's not a laundry list or a to-do list. It is a menu of options. Pick 1 or 2. If everyone does 1 or 2 things from the take action section of the book, a lot of change could happen. So the first thing is really simple, which is buy half of what you currently do. So consume less, bring less things into your home. And the reality is that means you reduce your exposure, but it also means we're reducing the demand for these products. And that actually doesn't sound too wild if you think about how much less we consumed 15 years ago with the kind of explosion of overnight delivery and the expectations that we've all kind of been trained and accustomed to. The result, like the stats are pretty staggering of how much more we're consuming, whether it's clothes or different types of products than we used to. So try to kind of like reverse that and be mindful, bring half of what you typically do into your home. The second is around, like I have a lot of consumer tips of kind of recommending there's only a few certifications that I think are really kind of moving the needle and backed by science. So looking for products that are Made Safe certified or EWG verified. No certification is perfect. No tool is perfect. But those are, grounded in solid science, as is cleaners. If you see the EPA Safer Choice certification, that's a very credible certification as well. And I think the final thing that I encourage people to do, which is to know that your consumer choices matter. We can talk about some of the kind of cool science to like show us that changing your products actually does impact toxic chemicals in your body. But you can't control or shop your way to safety. Mm-hmm. And that's one of the biggest kind of misconceptions people have, and where people can really get in what I see as like an obsessive mindset, where they take kind of some of the playbook from diet culture of like the more control is better, that we all grew up with, and they start to do that with our products. And the reality is, I actually find it really empowering that I cannot shop my way to safety. Some people will be like, "Oh, that's super depressing. What's the point anyway?" But if you really invest in the majority, like slowly transitioning things that are priorities, like your mattresses that you and your children are sleeping on. If you have a couch before 2015 that was built, like prioritize and save up to transition that couch out because of flame retardants. And then little things like don't sweat the small stuff, because at the end of the day, what I really ask people to do is you should still have enough energy left to call your state and federal elected officials and say, hey, look, this is not something that moms should have on our to-do list. Mm-hmm. Moms today are overwhelmed. Playing spot the toxic chemical is not something I should have on my to-do list in the morning. And instead, we should remove toxic chemicals from the market. Please pass legislation that helps regulate companies away from these toxic offenders. And so I kind of ask people to not become the perfectionists, which I think gives a lot of fodder to people that are starting to dismiss this field of science, unfortunately, and really should keep us focused on the bigger systemic change, which is where the large scale change can happen.
I feel like I take a deep breath when you tell me just to buy less and that I can't shop my way to safety, because when you don't feel like you are in control or can be in full control, you do take a deep breath. You take a step back and say like, okay, let's what's actionable here? And I mean, just moving my 4-year-old into a big boy bed, I was like, okay, we're buying you a good mattress. We're making sure that it's clean and safe. And I think like, I kind of think that way, like whatever's on my skin, whatever's touching my skin, like your mattress you're in, your sheets, and then let's like, are you putting lotion on your body or soap or body wash? Like what's your hierarchy of like where someone should start and work their way through cleaning out their house?
Yeah, good question. So I definitely encourage people to focus on the largest exposures to the most problematic chemicals. So a good example of that we just talked about is mattresses or couches. So toxic flame retardants and different types of mattress materials. In particular, some of the foams can off-gas very strongly, which many people have experienced, which is typically a sign of VOCs, volatile organic compounds. So think about the big things that are going to take a little bit of an investment, so time to save up for it, and that's okay. And then where, again, something like a flame retardant is something that is persistent, so it stays in our bodies and in our environment for a long time, versus something like, think about a shampoo. And again, if you can't afford to shop for a cleaner, safer shampoo, it is something that your exposure in the shower is relatively minimal compared to something like a foundation or a body lotion that's going to stay on your body all day. So thinking about things, and I give people tips about like how to prioritize, because I really want people to focus on this bigger conversation, which I think we're ready for, honestly. People are getting fatigued on the avoid this toxic chemical or ingredient wars and misinformation on social media. Mm-hmm. And I think people are ready to make the connection between the products in their homes and the impacts it's having across the entire product's life cycle.
Mm-hmm. I think it's hard for consumers when we hear things like, okay, BPA is pulled out of baby bottles, or it's pulled out of this lining of a can. And then we learn that, well, the chemical companies are avoiding having to put BPA on the can, but they've changed the chemical just slightly enough for it not to be BPA, but it's also just as much of an endocrine disrupting chemical. Like how much, you talk about greenwashing, but like how much like chemical deviations and things are happening behind the scenes that are just, having the same impact on our human health, but really just as toxic.
Yeah, I think it happens a lot in the plasticizer industry in particular. So you gave a great example with BPA. Or in the case of phthalates, I helped work on both state and federal legislation to ban certain types of phthalates, which are plasticizer chemicals that make plastic soft. They're also hormone disruptors in children's toys. And while the overall use of those phthalates went down, other phthalates increased in their use across the CPG space. This is what we call regrettable substitutions in the industry. And it's the exact reason that when people say, oh, well, I don't, I find the middle ground in everything. But when people are like, oh, we can't have, like, our federal agencies aren't doing our job, the government or our agencies are the problem. Let's let the market fix it. This is a great example of the market's not going to fix itself. So this is why I always tell people we need to push companies to make better decisions. And ask harder questions. And we also need to simultaneously pass laws, because what you're describing is a regulatory failure. What should happen, and some of the experts that I interview in the book, is that we should be banning classes of chemicals. So not just one specific flame retardant. We should be banning halogenated flame retardants. It's a class of chemicals that have similar characteristics and oftentimes similar negative health or environmental impacts. And so if you take a comprehensive class-based approach to regulation, then you really start to move the needle. And so that's where I think we're ready to go next, and where I hope this book starts to kind of spark some of that conversation. The final thing I'll say, Kelly, is that a lot of this also has to do with a question you asked me that I realized I didn't answer, which is advice for founders that are kind of interested in getting into this space. One of the biggest things that I think is missing and why greenwashing is happening, or cleanwashing is happening in the industry, is that a lot of people aren't hiring experts in safety or sustainability early on within their companies. And so again, if you don't have the right people on staff, and it's amazing, you go on LinkedIn for a lot of these cool brands that are making products that are safer, they don't have any sort of safety experts on staff. And I'm not talking about like old school toxicologists. I'm talking about people that can easily say, okay, well, we're going to move away from this BPA resin for this aluminum can, but we're not going to use BPS because it's a chemically similar resin, And if you don't have people on staff, if you're not investing in that, you're just kind of relying on retailer certifications, or again, relying on a contract manufacturer to say, oh, it's not using these types of chemicals, you're not going to be able to get ahead of this kind of whack-a-mole situation.
I am so excited to share with you guys an incredible scientific breakthrough to support our long-term health and wellness. Meet Fatty 15, powered by C15, the world's first essential fatty acid discovered in over 90 years. Scientists are calling it the longevity nutrient, and for good reason. Fatty 15 was founded by Dr. Stephanie Van Watson, who uncovered C15 while studying aging dolphins. Her research revealed something incredible. C15 works by strengthening our cells, improving our mitochondrial function, and protecting us against damaging free radicals. The result? Better long-term metabolic, liver, and heart health. Fatty 15 is powered by pure vegan-friendly form of C15 and an odd-chain saturated fatty acid that's more stable than most polyunsaturated fats. That means it resists oxidation, staying potent in the bottle and in your body. It turns out that many of us are deficient in C15, which results in weaker cells that make less energy and quit working earlier than they should. All of that makes us age faster, sleep poorly, and feel sluggish. But by replenishing our cells with that essential C15 nutrient, the only ingredient in Fatty 15 effectively repairs our cells and restores our long-term health. Plus, it comes with a gorgeous reusable glass jar and refill capsules shipped quarterly right to your door. Fatty 15 is on a mission to replenish your C15 levels and restore your long-term health. You can get an additional 15% off their 90-day subscription starter kit by going to fatty15.com/Kelly15 and using the code Kelly15 at checkout. So there are obviously a bunch of harmful chemicals in our home, but there are action steps that you teach your readers and your audience that follow you on Instagram to do. What are some of like the affordable or free options that can lower our toxic load other than buying less?
Sure. So the first thing I recommend is to transition your cookware. A lot of the kind of access to things like cast iron and stainless steel doesn't come at a cost. So, and I certainly know I like to shop secondhand. A lot of these types of stainless steel and cast iron cookware are very affordable secondhand, or certainly at places like Costco or your local retailer. The second thing is a lot of cleaners are now much more affordable. This is a good signal of originally when you kind of have safer products in the marketplace, they're a premium at first, but then over time, those costs can come down. So there's a lot of affordable cleaners, but some of the most affordable cleaners are things like lemon rinds and vinegar, which sounds really simple, but vinegar's, responsible. It can kill 97% of bacteria and viruses. So highly effective, also very affordable. And then another thing is something that I always hate to give people advice to actually vacuum and clean their home more, but the more you can control dust in your house, it is actually a really meaningful way to help reduce your toxic chemical exposure. And if you're anything like me, I call myself a skeptic. I wasn't forever. When I first learned about this issue, actually that first conversation I had when I was interviewing for the consumer safety job that I told you about, the woman was talking about exposure to household dust. And I was like, oh, come on. You're telling me that my dust is going to hurt me. That's not the takeaway. But there is a bunch of peer-reviewed science that shows that the more you can kind of use HEPA filters in your vacuum and dust, whether it's, with microfiber cloth or different types of safer cleaning agents, you can actually reduce the amount of things like plasticizers, phthalates, flame retardants that end up in household dust, and then we end up having in our bodies. And so it's something that is kind of an unexpected way to help reduce your exposure, in addition to other small things like taking your shoes off and leaving them at the front door instead of wearing your shoes in your home, which can help track different things like pesticides and heavy metals into your home.
So we touched on it a little bit earlier, but you were going to explain how we can lower our toxic load and what the studies show in regards to how fast are we removing these chemicals from our bodies. I just want to motivate people to get in there and microfiber with a wet microfiber and use their HEPA vacuums. Like, what is it really doing in our body when we lower our toxic load?
Yeah. So there's been a bunch of really cool science. It's called biomonitoring. It's where someone, either through their hair, their blood, or their urine, has different levels of toxic chemicals studied. And so there's been intervention studies. I'll give you a couple examples. The first of which, a group called Silent Spring Institute, a team of researchers, they took families, and for 3 days, they had chefs come into their home, and they only ate freshly prepared foods, which is not realistic for most of us, myself included. I have plenty of packaged foods in my home. But what they were doing is they were trying to look to see if the exposure to different plasticizer chemicals from food packaging would have any sort of, change in the time that they were just eating fresh fruits and vegetables. And what they found is that within 3 days, the level of BPA, bisphenol A that we talked about, decreased by 60% within 3 days. And then they went back to their normal diets, and then they were tested again, and the levels went exactly back up. So the chart actually looks like a V from this intervention study. Another example is when you look at longer term data from when we banned lead from gasoline and from paint. The CDC has incredible data showing the US population, especially the children population, the blood lead levels absolutely plummeted, showing that these large scale public health regulations are often the wins are unseen, because you can't tell when you have X toxic chemical reducing in an overall population. But these longitudinal studies show us that a lot of these both policy and consumer choices can make a huge difference. And then the final thing I'll say is there was a great study from UC Berkeley that looked at teenagers, Latina teenagers specifically. And it was a 3-day intervention. They gave them cosmetics and personal care products that were formulated without some of the kind of worst offenders, phthalates, triclosan, oxybenzone, et cetera. And similar. So the percentage reduction within 3 days was between 30 and 45% based on which chemical they were studying, which is a very fast reduction within just 3 short days. So if you feel like, oh, this feels like an overwhelming topic, just go back to some of the science that says, look, if you prioritize some of these key product areas, you're really going to be reducing your overall exposure. And then, of course, save a little energy for the bigger fight.
Right. So when it comes to, first of all, it's really motivating to know that our body is like, our body wants to heal, it wants to detox, it wants these chemicals out of our system. Are there ways to support your body to do that? And then are there ways to test your home or your body to understand where your toxic load's at?
Yeah. I have a position on this that maybe some will disagree with, I'm sure they will, but the majority of the kind of like detox diets out there are mostly a scam.
Yeah.
What I will say though, is that your body is designed, we have organs that help us naturally detoxify, eating certain types of foods like leafy greens, for example, helps kind of increase that. We have natural detox pathways through breathing and through going to the bathroom, for example, sweating. These are all natural systems that our body has. So you can trust in that, which is great. I generally, the more that you can kind of reduce your exposure, the better. I have had my body tested for toxic chemicals through the Silent Spring Institute as part of a larger kind of cohort study. I think for most people, I actually don't know how much they can really properly interpret, because this is, when I had my body tested, for example, I had all the context when I saw my results, not to be like overly alarmed by them. And sometimes I think they can like feed people into getting into a little bit of an obsessive state that maybe doesn't always help. And so what I would like us to do is to kind of shift our thinking. I think personal choices are incredibly important. I do think we should focus on our personal health, but I also want us to think about public health when we think about our whole population. So not just about like, how can I optimize my home and my health, but also how can we start to shift the marketplace, shift our laws. So like the lead example I gave earlier, when we had these widespread changes in removing lead, we saw widespread reductions. I want us to start to kind of shift the thinking there, because if we don't, then we'll leave communities that are overexposed, including those here in the United States that are living next to these chemical manufacturing plants. They could be forgotten, and we don't want that.
Yeah, no, it's all of that political change will raise all boats and keep everyone a lot healthier. So when you think about, making big sweeping changes like the lead legislation, what are your hopes and dreams for what the future holds in regards to big sweeping changes in removing certain chemicals or heavy metals from our environment?
So I think I'll kind of talk about just like three kind of main areas. The first of which is that I hope that we can prevent any rollbacks from existing laws that currently are in place, some of which are currently being threatened, like PFAS and wastewater. It looks like there was a threat to having the asbestos ban that was just passed in 2023. If you can imagine, rollback looks like that, at least because of pressure from people like you and I calling Congress. Thankfully, it looks like we've stopped that rollback from happening. But so the first is just like, we don't want to roll back the existing laws we currently have. Second is that I really want us to start to look at what I mentioned before, looking at classes of chemicals that have enough science. I'm not talking about like 1 or 2 studies. I'm talking about there's scientific consensus about a lot of these larger chemical classes like PFAS, for example. We need to start to regulate classes of chemicals to really start to turn off the tap and reduce our exposure. And then the next thing is that we really have a lot more work to do on the beauty and personal care side of things. We helped, pass through my work and many others, the first update to cosmetic safety laws since 1938, back in 2023, which was great. But the reality is that there's still a lot more action that's needed. We've got fragrance ingredients that are still kept secret from consumers. The worst of the worst ingredients like PFAS in cosmetics, mercury and skin lightening creams are still allowed to be used. And so we have to really kind of strengthen and, beef up that particular piece of legislation. And then the final thing is, I think one of the things I'm excited about is increased testing transparency. So I testified in front of the California legislature recently in support of a bill that would require companies to share heavy metal test results for prenatal vitamins. And I think that's a really common sense thing that companies should be willing to do. And it helps create a positive incentive for companies to try to find better sources, because a lot of reducing heavy metal contamination comes to finding better sources. And you don't have to do that if your test results are hidden in a black box.
Right. When it comes to third-party testing that would verify, or COAs from companies that would make you feel safe about taking something, like, are there third-party testing certifications that you look for? Are there things that you don't take because they're inherently like high in heavy metals? Like, what's on your like yes list versus your no list when it comes to consumer products?
Yeah, I think so. One of the certifications I like, especially in the food and supplement space, is Clean Label Project. They test for over 200 common contaminants, including heavy metals, pesticides, plasticizers, and they also have a purity award. So companies that test in the like safest threshold of the widespread consumer marketing testing that they've done. So I think they're a good first step, especially for that particular category. And I think it is helpful. It's nice to know that someone else is testing. I think a lot of companies in the supplement and food space are already testing their products. There's varying degrees of quality or sensitivity around testing equipment that can obviously impact those results. So having a third party is like a nice stamp and seal of approval. As I mentioned, for beauty and personal care, EWG verified is great. There is additional testing that's required in addition to passing the actual ingredient screening that happens. So I like that they do have a consumer product testing angle as a part of that certification. So those are things that I really like to look out for. And then as far as what I avoid, I think it's kind of it's a hard question to answer. I do cover a lot of this in my book. But I think at the end of the day, when it comes to things like contaminants, this is where really asking companies to, number one, do you test and do you share those tests publicly? If a company can't give me a straight answer, I'm probably not going to support them.
Mm-hmm.
So I've asked a lot of companies in the clean beauty space that have certifications from certain retailers that make clean claims around their testing for heavy metals and PFAS, for example, in color cosmetics, which is where those typically show up either as intentional ingredients like PFAS or as contaminants. And the majority of them aren't doing testing. It's very clear based on their responses that they're just not testing, or they certainly don't want to talk more about the testing openly. And for me, that's just a pretty big red flag. If I get a response from a company that, number one, takes a little bit longer and it's long and it explains things to me, I actually trust that a lot more, because it means that there's someone there that's actually like putting thought in responding versus just sending some sort of canned legal response.
Right. What are some of the long-term health effects of something like a PFAS or a heavy metal? Like, what is driving your need to get those out of our environment and also encourage companies to lower their products exposure for us?
Yep. So it depends on the different toxic elements have different health effects. For example, mercury and lead are most notorious for their impacts to brain health. So it's why something like I mentioned for prenatal vitamins is particularly important, but certainly as, for children and for adults. And so when I think about the reasons why, especially for things like toxic elements and heavy metals, a lot of it is both due to the persistence. So it's hard once you get some of these chemicals in your body to get them out. So reducing our exposure in the first place is always a good first step. Second would be the level of toxicity. So when we're talking about irreversible brain damage, that obviously sounds very scary, and it is. And it's one of those things where I'm never going to be able to fully control that, but the degree to which I can, I'm going to try.
Mm-hmm.
And then something like PFAS is, it's been linked to a lot of different things. For example, I grew up in Minnesota, which is where I start my book, headquarters of 3M. There's a lot of PFAS contamination in the drinking water in certain communities here, especially a couple decades ago when I was younger. And there's links to things like non-alcoholic fatty liver disease, which is dramatically on the rise for a variety of reasons, both from the kind of increased reliance on processed and packaged foods. Not that I have anything against packaged foods, but also classes of chemicals like PFAS that are increasing. Fatty liver is a very real issue that has a lot of silent impacts to people. It also is linked to hormone disruption. So again, messing with our natural hormone balance is really delicate, as we know, through lots of different life stages. And the degree to which we already have enough hormone changes as someone who's in perimenopause, it's like, there's already enough that I can't control. Like, I don't need any additional factors messing. So I think, again, when you look at the richness of science, again, there's a lot of dismissers out there that take issue with any sort of claims of a lot of conversations around this. And I think what I call people to do in my book is to say, look, this is nuanced science. It's hard to always have a smoking gun, but guess what? There's a lot of peer-reviewed science, and that is the gold standard of science, showing us that classes of chemicals like PFAS are linked to widespread environmental and public health harm. And if anyone were to give you, I'll go back to like an early stunt I did when I was lobbying, when I was young, which is 2 baby bottles or 2 rubber duckies. One had BPA and one did not. One had phthalates, the rubber ducky did, and one did not. And I held it up to the Minnesota legislature and I was like, if you had a choice to choose between these 2 products, and I told you that one of them had an ingredient that was linked to birth defects, in that case, it was phthalates. There was no cost difference, which sometimes there's a cost difference, sometimes there is not. Which one would you choose? Even if there was a shred of doubt, and everyone always says, well, let's make it without. So the question is, and a lot of the backlash that I see is, number one, we have to be responsible in talking about the science and links to health outcomes. Number two, there is real science, and let's not dismiss that. And if we have the opportunity to make these products safer, which we know we can, why wouldn't we?
Yeah. Why wouldn't we? And your book's going to help people do that. Take action, become activists, and help other families clean up their homes. You're a mom and an activist. When you think about a growing child in utero, a baby in utero, and when they're small, Julian's only 2 years old, what is the difference between toxic chemical exposure for a child in utero and a toddler versus a teenager or an adult?
Yep. So what research shows, and this is why organizations like the American Academy of Pediatrics and ACOG, major medical organizations, Endocrine Society, have all created consensus statements and position papers on reducing toxic chemical exposure, especially for these vulnerable populations, including pregnant women and children. It's because, especially for children, we know that pound for pound, the exposure to air, water, and food, and kind of the nature of how children are on the floor more, they just have increased exposure routes. So what that means is, if you look at some of this biomonitoring studying that I was talking about earlier, there's a study that came out of the state of California about 15 years ago that found that toddlers had 4 times the amount of flame retardants in their bodies as compared to their parents. And part of the reason for that was the unique nature of how children put their hands in their mouths much more than we do as adults. And so again, linking back to that conversation I shared earlier about household dust, children are crawling on the ground and they create these little invisible dust balls that they're just inhaling more of these chemicals. They're putting their fingers in their mouths, which is increasing the exposure to things like flame retardants. And so it's not really a surprise when, especially as a parent, you see how your children behave and kind of interact with their home environment much differently than we do. And then you also have things like children's nap mats at daycares or play tents that are treated with flame retardants, which don't need to be treated with flame retardants, that are, again, increasing the exposure because they're playing with their toys. And to me, again, this just feels like a no-brainer. This feels very unjust that we would allow manufacturers to use things like toxic flame retardants on products that are children and designed specifically for children to use.
Yeah. I mean, I've brought things into my home, opened the packaging, and whether it was pajamas or, some type of baby toy or whatever that smells horrible, and had to like decide not to keep it or, dispose of it or figure out how to get those out of my house, leave it outside for a while. Like you can smell the chemicals, and it's so strong. It's like when you start to pull that stuff out of your house, it's like an immediate headache for me.
Yeah.
Which is so when it comes to like the main things, like when you're thinking about flooring, because I think about Julian, he's walking now and running and riding a Strider bike, but before it's like he's crawling around on the ground, like you're talking about. He's on the rugs, he's on the carpets, he's cuddling the stuffies. Like when it comes to like ground floor, like what's best in class to remove and get rid of as many PFAS as you can, and VOCs and all of that?
Yep. So good question. I think there's a few things. It depends. I rented for a really long time. When you don't have control over your home environment, especially something like flooring, all is not lost if you're renting. So just know that first and foremost. If you do have carpets, the more you can vacuum, great. Doesn't mean you have to vacuum every day, but instead of doing it once a week, maybe try twice a week. The second is that you can also, if you have wood floors, that's great. Wood floors are excellent. Knowing that those aren't always kid friendly, just be mindful of the type of rugs that you purchase. So I usually have kind of a red flag when I see words like stain resistant or spill proof. That's usually a clear indicator for either rugs or for treatments that are used on couches. That yes, it's great if you could drop a glass of red wine or something on your rug and not have it stain. But those are PFAS chemicals that are used to repel something. And so kind of avoid rugs, et cetera, on your floor that have those different types of marketing material. Oftentimes you can always ask the company. Not everyone has time to be able to do that. And then the final thing I'll say is that I would also avoid, if you do have the choice, avoid vinyl flooring. So vinyl is kind of nicknamed the poison plastic because at every stage of its life cycle, it has some sort of toxic input. So everything from the vinyl chloride, that is actually the chemical that goes to make the plastic, to when it's in your home, including on your flooring, and certainly when it's incinerated later in life. The whole life cycle of vinyl is something I just generally try to stay away from. So there's some of the kind of old school things like linoleum are actually safer, but there's great resources, organizations like the Healthy Building Network that can help guide some of those purchasing decisions as well.
Great. I love those resources. I feel like you end up on blogs and you're like, I don't know if this is right or wrong. And you want to control the controllable and not break the bank. When it comes to like air and water, like those are tough. Like for a long time, Chris and I lived in an apartment in Brentwood. We were renting there, and, I was using the Britas, and then I was switching to a Berkey, and then, just trying to find like the best water filter to clean out. Are there water filters available right now, or air filters available right now that you recommend, that you think do a good job removing not only like chemicals, but is there any way to get these microplastics out of our water?
Yeah, microplastics is a whole related and important topic that is really hard. We don't have a lot of answers, both on exactly how harmful they are to our bodies. One, the study that came out that showed that average American has the amount of a plastic spoon of microplastic in our brain feels like an insult to me. And I don't want to be a part of that type of experiment. I think a lot of people would feel that same way. But microplastics are harder. So first and foremost, but there are a lot of really great, not always expensive air and water filters that can actually really help, especially when it comes to some of these kind of emerging contaminants, common pesticides, heavy metals, et cetera. So the first thing is what I did for years when I was renting a traditional charcoal filter, like what is used in Brita, but I like Pure because you can actually attach it directly to your faucet. Then it doesn't have to sit in some sort of plastic container in your house. Those are pretty affordable, Pure water filters, and you're gonna like get some of the like larger contaminants filtered out. if you do want to do a reverse osmosis system in your house, you can. But what I always encourage people to, and part of the kind of resources in my book, is to you can actually get your tap water tested, because the type of filtration system you need is really unique to where you're living. So if you're living in rural Iowa, you're really likely going to have more things like pesticides, glyphosate, atrazine that you're going to want to like prioritize what type of water filter you have, versus if you're in more urban environments and things like old lead pipes are a priority, then a more kind of traditional charcoal filter is a direction you want to go in. And then air filters, I think, are really critically important, especially now, not just on the West Coast, all over the country. People are having a lot of things like wildfire smoke, which is also another environmental pollutant that doesn't come from our products, but is definitely problematic. So again, you don't have to break the bank. There's a lot of very expensive air filters out there. We purchased a bunch of filters for each of our houses from Walmart, for example, that were not expensive, but they were HEPA filters. And so look for a HEPA filter. And again, that's the main thing you need to look for versus cost, because just because you're paying more doesn't mean that you're actually any safer.
Are there any bills or pieces of legislation that you would like to see move through to like in the next year or two to protect us that we can support you on and your mission?
Yeah, thanks for asking that. I think there's a few. So I would check out, if you want to know what's happening in your state, there's an amazing organization called Safer States. So saferstates.org, where they have a state-by-state tracker. Right now, most legislative sessions, with the exception of California and some other states, most legislatures aren't in session. But what you can do is see where there's active pieces of legislation and how to get involved. So I love Safer States. Definitely check out, because some of the most meaningful work is happening at the state level. Second, if you are in the state of California, the heavy metal prenatal testing transparency bill, SB 646, is already passed the Senate. It's heading through the Assembly as we speak. So definitely call them and share your support for that piece of legislation. And then the final thing I'll say is, at the federal level, just make sure that regardless of your political party, I believe that there is room and space for everyone, regardless of politics, in this movement. I've always felt that way. Regardless of your political beliefs, make sure you hold your members of Congress accountable and let them know that you do not want any rollbacks to the existing laws we do have on toxic chemicals. Because right now, that's where we're kind of in watchdog mode to make sure that some of those water, air, and products pieces of legislation stay intact.
Yeah. Very, very important. Well, we'll put all these resources in the show notes. I'm really, really excited about your book. I love the stories you tell about your early years as an activist and what that looked like. I feel like for so many moms and parents alike, like your heart is in protecting your children, like you just, there's something about it being about someone else and their bodies being so much more, just having like a higher bioaccumulation than we have. It's scary. It makes you motivated, but I don't want to be scared. And I think you do a good job in your book of not making us scared, just helping us be informed and take action. And for anyone listening, Cleaning House is available. And if you go to the action items, there is so much we can do every day to change our toxic exposure. Lindsay, thank you so much for being here, for sharing your knowledge. It was such a pleasure to have you on the show. I'm really excited for your book to make waves.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having me.
Where can people follow along? Where can they continue to learn from you and the products and companies that you love and champion?
Thank you. I think the best thing people can do is purchase the book, because I have connections and links to all of the best resources. I am also on Substack, where it's just Lindsay Dahl at substack.com. And I'm also on Instagram at Lindsay_Dahl. And I hope people follow. And at the end of the day, I hope that people feel a little bit of inspiration, a little bit more clarity, and a little less pressure than the confusing barrage of information that we have to navigate every single day.
Yes. Well, you make it clear and actionable, and that's what we need right now. So thank you for your work.
Thank you.
Thank you for tuning in to this episode of the Be Well by Kelly LeVeque podcast. If you enjoyed the show, please consider leaving a review in your favorite podcast app and subscribing on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or YouTube. We're also excited to share that full-length video episodes are now on YouTube and Spotify, so you can watch along as you listen. The best way to support me and the show is by sharing it with your friends and family. Your recommendations make all the difference. This is a Wellness Loud production produced by Drake Peterson. The video is recorded by Luke Rodriguez and edited by Jesse Trout. Sound mixing is by Mike Fry. See you next time.
The content of this show is for educational and informational purposes only. It is not a substitute for individual medical or mental health advice and does not constitute a provider-patient relationship. As always, talk to your doctor or healthcare team first. Shout out to the Newport Beach Pendry for hosting us. I'm so grateful to record in such a beautiful space that truly elevates the podcast experience for myself and my guests. From the stunning design to their incredible hospitality, it's a perfect setting for meaningful conversations and creative energy. Hey, thanks, Pendry.